Welcome to Let's Talk Ball. I'm Thad Brown along with Carl Jones. Normally during the regular season, we are here breaking down the X's and the O's of every single Bills regular season game. But here in the springtime, we're doing it with draft prospects. And we're going to go through the 9 players, not player by player. I'm sure you've seen a ton of that by now. But we're going to discuss our takes, kind of our overriding big picture views of the draft class. And that was the original plan, which we will still do. But now, Carl, we got to start with the Bills general manager just spitting fire on the radio today. If anyone hasn't heard by now, Brandon Beane was on WGR radio, and I think it was probably a prearranged regular post-draft press conference, and he was super unhappy with the conversation between Jeremy White and Joe DiBiase, who are great, by the way, who were talking about the lack of receivers, at least taken early in this draft. And for people who don't, maybe not follow WGR, Jeremy White is a big wide receiver guy. Like he builds his life around wide receivers. And right or wrong, it's a fun thing to talk about. I get it. But today, Brandon Beane did not like the idea that he had failed anyway by not grabbing receivers, and he based it primarily on, look at what we did last year with no great, no elite, no Stephon Diggs level wide receiver. So, Carl, this is what most people have been talking about today. Give me your take, your reaction to what Brandon Beane had to say on the radio this morning.
I want to separate it into 2 separate buckets. What he said in terms of content, and then maybe how he delivered the message. In terms of how he delivered the message, I wasn't the biggest fan of it. I know that when I'm not like over here screaming for PG everywhere, but I think he could have did without the cursing aspect of it. I didn't really agree with that. But
I'm with you there in general. Like there's, if you're a good enough speaker, you shouldn't need to use swear words 98% of the time. Go ahead.
Right. And listen, that didn't bother me as much, but I think that was something that I'm like, hey, I don't know if I like that. And then also, I don't think he was talking down at them, because I want to get into this. I think he was talking to a lot of Bills fans at large, and I don't think this was just directly towards Jeremy. I think that was just like who faced the brunt of his frustrations in terms of people complaining about the lack of investment at wide receiver. So I'll start with there. I thought that he could have handled his frustrations a little better in that regard. Now, in terms of his content of what he's talking about, I fall in the bucket of, like, here's how I've always felt about investments in towards wide receivers when you have a superstar quarterback cyborg back there. You pick one bucket or the other generally in terms of how you want to in terms of how you want to surround that player. Is either A, you put the monster, you put a whole lot of resources at wide receiver and you expect him to uplift the 5 players in front of him. Or you go the inverse. Hey, we'll protect you. You uplift the guys out wide. I think that he has chosen to use the offensive lineman, that approach, and I think it's been highly successful. Obviously, there are room to improve at wide receiver, but that's the bucket he's chose. And then you don't have to, you know me, I'm all for putting resources onto the defensive side of the ball, so I am all for how they approached his draft. But I tend to fall on his side of things in terms of, hey, man, like, we got a quarterback taking up X amount of the salary cap. The resources have to go somewhere.
To your point there, the thing that I could not agree with Brandon Beane more on, the thing I'm 1,000% on board with, is when he said, look, I can't make every position great. That's not how this league is built. You can't be awesome everywhere. Even the Eagles, who won the Super Bowl last year, probably aren't great at safety. We could talk about the quarterback, how good he is. You're just not going to have everything. And this kind of goes back to what you said. You have to pick and choose your battles. Now, I think you can build an offense that has a really good O-line and a really good receivers and a really good running back, because the Eagles have all of that. But it doesn't mean you have to, or it's some failing if you don't. And when you're going to criticize a Bills team that is pretty good in just about most every other area because they're not as good as receiver, I do understand why Brandon Beane would look at that and say it was dumb. And look, some of that is because of the nature of talk radio. If you're a sports station and you got 24 hours to fill, at some point you're going to get to the position group who ain't that good. But it doesn't mean that there's a failing for Brandon Beane. The other part of this, though, where I kind of had a problem with the way Brandon Beane approached it, is his argument for I don't need to upgrade receiver is, look at what we did last year.
I don't know.
He's like, he's like, look, I get when you guys were wondering about we got rid of Stephon Diggs, what we're going to do, but last year was great. And how can you say something this year? Because in the same breath, Brandon Beane's also going to say, and did say, and I'm going to put a little bit of words in his mouth here, but he said this receiving group is better on paper. That's what he's trying to point out, that, like, look, we were good last year and we upgraded the receiving group. Well, when you subtract Mac Hollins and Amari Cooper and add in Josh Palmer, I don't know if there's a needle mover among the three there. So don't tell me they're better because of that move. At worst, at bottom line, you've had two depart and one come in. But you're going to tell me that it's going to be better, I think, in large part because you think Dalton Kincaid is going to get better and because you think Keon Coleman's going to get better. Well, Keon Coleman last year did not do a whole lot that tells me he's going to be a great player in the NFL. But I'm not going to just look at last year because it's 1 year, right? I can't look at a rookie and say he had one bad year and therefore that's who he is. But by the same token, you cannot look at that one good year of this unique approach to an offense and say, we're good, that it's above criticism right now. Because not only is it just 1 year of going about everybody eats, that 1 year came with a ridiculously healthy offensive line, a ridiculously healthy running back group, a season of fumble luck where the Bills, no joke, recovered 86% of their fumbles. That ain't happening again. So it doesn't mean that the offense is not going to work. It very well may. But you can't sit there and say that is the dumbest argument ever, which is what Brandon Beane's words were today, that the receivers weren't good based on 1 good year of offense where you had a lot of things go your way.
A couple points there. One, back to the Eagles for a second here. The Eagles do, on paper, probably have the best roster. I do want to add some history as to how they got there. The Eagles were able to add 2 top 10 talents at their positions because they were bad for 2 years. Like, the only way you're able to get Jalen Carter is by being terrible. So, like, I know Bills fans, you want Jalen Carter. You only get Jalen Carter if you're a top 10, if you pick in the top 10. The Eagles were bad 1 year, and that's how they were able to get him.
For the Bills, it would have to be Josh Allen getting hurt. That's the only way you're getting those guys ever.
And the same thing happened when they got Devonta Smith. So, like, the Eagles still have a fantastic roster, and they skimp corners in some ways, like we just mentioned at safety. But I hear people's point on that regard, but I don't think the Eagles are the model just based off how they got there. The Bills, it's just not realistic unless Josh gets hurt. Now, I think 2 things can be true about the receiver room. Is the receiver room not great? No, it's not. Like, if you compare it to the rest of the contenders around the league, if you told me it was dead last, I wouldn't fight you on it. I truly wouldn't fight you on it. But I need someone to tell me where was the avenue to significantly improve that room that didn't come at the expense of taking away resources from a defense that has been, and I'm not being facetious here, historically awful in the postseason the last 5 years in elimination games. I am not trying to be hyperbole there. I am not trying to say, oh my gosh, like the sky is falling. When you look at the numbers in elimination games over their last 5,
the games they've lost.
The games that they've lost, they are in their own like little quadrant of bad. Like, I'm talking like prime Aaron Rodgers Packers bad. And if anyone who wants to know about those Packers teams, go back and look at them. Aaron Rodgers was basically fighting a uphill battle with his hand behind his back. He had a machete and everyone else had AK-47s. That's how bad we're talking about. And I'm not trying to exaggerate things here. Go look at the numbers. Like, the numbers don't lie. But I think 2 things can be true though. Yes, the receiver room isn't great and they need to improve it. But in this particular offseason, the free agency wasn't good. There really weren't any receivers that exchanged teams on the trade market that would have significantly improved the team. And then I really was in favor of overhauling the defense in the draft. So if you want to argue me that 2023 should have been handled differently, I am all for it. I think they should have handled that draft much differently. But this offseason, they've kind of made the bed already with those investments in Dalton Kincaid and Keon Coleman and Curtis Samuel, giving him all that money. I think you kind of had to eat your medicine for at least 1 more year before you do a complete overhaul for that room.
You're right. The only way that this goes any differently is if the Bills exchange a receiver for one of TJ Sanders, Landon Jackson, or Deion Walker, and maybe even Maxwell Hairston with a first-round pick. You got to sacrifice one of those defensive guys, who I think we all like to some degree, for a receiver. The other 2 points I want to make to close this out. Number one, it's funny. We think of the wide receiver group as bad, terrible, some level of that. Well, I'm looking at Mike Clay. I don't know if anybody ever follows him, but he does the big charts on all the free agents every year. So he's pretty well-versed in what everybody has. Well, he just put out today his post-draft 2025 NFL unit grade. So quarterback, receiver, running back, tight end, etc. The Bills are better. He gives them, it's out of 10. He gives them a 6 out of 10. The Bills are better than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So he's got the Bills better than 9 teams in the NFL at receiver, which stunned me. Now, I didn't actually go through, like the Cardinals were one of the teams, Marvin Harrison, whatever. I think the point that you can be made there, though, is that there's a good chance that, yeah, the Bills don't have a high level receiver or maybe even a really good number two, but their threes and fours and fives might be better than a lot of teams, better than we're giving it credit for. The last thing I want to say about this is since the 13 seconds game, since 2021, the conversation about the Bills has been pretty much the same thing. How do they get over the hump? How do they get that last piece to finally get to a Super Bowl? And I've got to think that at this point, fans, media, and absolutely the front office of the Buffalo Bills are tired of that conversation. And it's starting to wear people out. And I think, especially this is the second time we've seen Brandon Beane kind of rant to the media. Last year at camp with Josh Allen, the overrated thing was the first one. Now this. And Brandon Beane is as cool and as genuine and as good a dude as you're going to find in the NFL. And the genuineness we appreciate in the media, even if it turns out this way. But I think the fact that the Bills have been banging their head against this wall over and over and over, I think is finally starting to boil over a little often when you get to some criticism of the way they build this roster.
Yeah, for sure. I know you can't be good at everything. I know some people will say, well, yeah, you can, and all that good jazz. I think this conversation is a tad different if the ending doesn't have the same exact ending every single year. If they happen to trip up into the wild card round and lose to the Patriots one year, or God forbid the Chargers, I think the tone is a little different. But when it's the same dude 4 out of 5 times, it kind of hurt a little differently, and then you get, like you said, it gets a little stale in terms of the conversation.
All right, speaking of stale, let's move on from that. I think we've exhausted, but good stuff. I appreciated that. I need to get that off my chest. I'm sure you kind of felt the same way, watching everybody talk about this today. Well, let's talk about the draft. And let's start right at the top with Maxwell Hairston, because look, in most drafts, the first round pick is going to be the bellwether guy for it either way. And this was a good, interesting pick for a lot of reasons. Went defense, filled the need, and also Carl brought it to mention the Bills have not had in that secondary for a long time, and that is ridiculous speed.
No, the Bills, I made this comparison on Buffalo Kickoff Live on Sunday. I don't mean to be disrespectful when I say this, but for my college football fans out there, whenever you watch a Big Ten team, Iowa, Ohio State of like 15 years ago, Michigan of 15 years ago, Penn State of those years, they were really good in conference, but they were kind of slow when they faced the big dogs from the SEC. And I felt the Bills defense has been that. They are good. But when you get to the prime moments, the AFC Championship game, the divisional round, the Super Bowl, if they were to make it that far, I felt like they didn't have the horses to compete with those teams at that level. Maxwell Hairston isn't a perfect fit. I mean, he's 5'11". I know he said he's 190. Let's see what you weigh in July. Let's see at that point, right? Or at least in September when you got to go through camp. I'll say all that to say, though, he adds that level of an athlete they just quite frankly haven't had. And I think that there's some give and take with that. When you take a prospect at 30, he's not going to be perfect. But I'm intrigued to see the type of things that they can do or maybe uplift with a player that has that level of athleticism that you just can't teach. I know that I was in love with Trey Amos because I was intrigued with how they were able to continue to refine the player that he already was. And I thought that he was pretty refined coming into the NFL. But a guy like Max Hairston has a lot of tools that you can sharpen a little bit. And the ceiling is much higher with someone like him as opposed to someone like Trey Amos, who I really loved and thought would be a good fit here in Buffalo.
With the speed end of it, there's a little Kyer Elam feel to it. I don't want everybody to freak out listening to that, but that one dimension in terms of the ability and the upside, there is some comparisons there. But I still look at Harrison and tell me if I'm wrong about this. After a couple years with the Bills in the first round with Dalton Kincaid and Kyer Elam, so far those two guys are whiffs. Kincaid obviously still, jury's still out. We'll see more development needed. But the Bills in both cases took bigger swings on high-level athletic guys, and it hasn't worked out yet. And while Hairston is that, because of his ability to play zone coverage, I think he fits a little more. To me, this is a little more of like a line drive, a double, a single, where I think the floor is higher. And after a couple years now, where, if you count Keon Coleman in as the first pick taken, the Bills haven't gotten impact from that guy. You need at some point to have that guy at least work a little bit. You don't got to be an all-pro, but at least for God's sakes, be a starter on the team that you can count on. And they haven't got that out of the last 3 guys so far. I think Hairston, Carl, is a better candidate to at least be, you can plug him in there, he's going to play. I mean, like, is Levi Wallace the floor for Hairston? Because if it is, I'd be not excited, but okay with this first round pick.
Yeah, because I know we've spoken about this off air a little bit in terms of when you see someone that runs a 4.2, you assume, oh my gosh, Deion Sanders, shadow him all across the field. based off of his size limitations, I just don't think that's in his cards as an NFL player. But he fits the zone bill in terms of if you're Sean McDermott, right, and you have a cornerback that's a 4.6, and all week, hey, backside of a 3-by-1 formation, you know what? We're going to give up the hitch there. Just tackle and rally to the formation. But if you're someone that you can trust that it has 4.28 speed, you know what? If you got the hunch that it's going to be a hitch backside or a slant, jump that bad boy. You know why? Because you have the athletic profile to recover down the field. And you know how I know that? That was me. I didn't have the greatest of hips. So I was a guy where, you know what? I was just going to give up the 3-yard route and rally to it. I didn't have the hips to swivel and get back down the field. But some of the more athletic guys in the room who had a little bit more grease on their hips, they were like, you know what? We'll take the chance right there because we have faith that we can catch the guy 20, 30 yards down the field. And if you have someone like that in Sean McDermott's room, I think he can get a little creative on how you play a simple zone coverage like that.
And Hairston's a guy who has 3 pick sixes in his career. One is exactly that. It's an outside route. I know it was a hitch route. I think it was a short out. Regardless, it's that kind of gamble to where if you see it, go jump it. And you talk about this all the time. And I want people at home to understand how much of, especially in the defensive secondary, you are playing. Hunches is the wrong word, but it's almost like you're playing tendencies. You're playing, hey, if I have my margin of error, if I can widen it a little bit, that gives me more opportunity to make this big play or take a shot at this big play. Because even if I'm beat, if to kind of put a fine point on it, even if Maxwell Hairston gets beat on trying to jump a play, he's getting beat for 15, not 50, because he can run downfield and make that play. Correct?
Yes, I had this conversation actually with Rasul Douglas off air a while ago. He goes, listen, when you out there at cornerback and all week, you see this formation and you know it's coming. You only get that once because the next time that you jump that and miss, you're getting double move for a touchdown. It only happens once. So if you have a player who you are willing to give them the keys and say, hey, go make that play, the one time is all you need. The PBU on third down is all you need. The pick six is all you need. Instead of when you have a player like a Levi Wallace, and no disrespect to him, or a Dane Jackson, who aren't as high on the athletic scale, you know what, Bucko? If you see the hitch, let the quarterback, let the grenade come out the hand before you drive on the ball. Max Hairston, hey, man, shoot your shot, my man.
All right, let's talk about the defensive lineman who went second, third, fourth round. And different flavors here. TJ Sanders, I think, is kind of the hopefully the 3-down guy, a guy they traded up for. Landon Jackson, again, a guy who can be, a 3-down player, but a little more of, I think, a pass rushing, stronger player. And then Deion Walker, who's obviously the jugundous run stuffer. Give me anything from those 3 guys that kind of stood out to you, whether it be the player taken, when they were taken, the trade up, trade down for a couple of these guys also as well.
Yeah, it was a huge emphasis on the defensive line. I guess we'll get on the categories in a second later, but basically they told you how they felt about their front four, right? But I'll let you give your flowers to Landon Jackson in a second, but I'll just say this. It is very, very, very intriguing to me that the guy that they traded up for in the second round plays the exact same position as Ed Oliver. So that's one of 2 things for me. Either A, they maybe view him as a player that can, I don't want to say replace, but smoothly slide into his position of Ed Oliver once he, ages out a little bit.
Is that motivation maybe? Is that where you're going with that?
This isn't a knock on Ed Oliver, but I'm just thinking how a team may view it. We're like, hey, we don't want to give him a 3rd contract. Like, hey, here's TJ Sanders to come in and be our next 3-tech for the future. I thought that was very intriguing because they could have easily at that point, I wouldn't have agreed with it, but taking that run stuffing guy at 41, I believe is when they took him. So I thought that was very intriguing that, listen, I don't know if there's a fit on 1st and 2nd down for TJ Sanders, but on 3rd down, you can get a little funky with him and Ed Oliver next to each other. I thought that was very intriguing for sure.
Ed Oliver's contract is probably something the Bills can't get out of for at least 2 more years. So if you're thinking that, and look, Ed Oliver's he was really good for the first half of 2023. 2024 wasn't as good. Better moments down the stretch. This is still a good player. This is not a player who I think the Bills are even planning to move on from. But I mean, look, you're not wrong that like if you wanted to find a guy to replace that Oliver for whatever reason, TJ Sanders is a pretty good candidate for that because he is a more natural 3-tech when it comes to, especially on rundowns. I was not a huge fan of the Sanders pick in the moment. The more I've thought about it, and you make a great point. I think this bears being brought up again. When it comes to pass rushing downs, there really isn't a 1-tech or a 3-tech. You don't have to have a nose and a tackle. You can have 2 tackles and let them out there, especially the way the Bills operate it. So many stunts and games. You want more athletic guys. And Sanders can be really good there. And something else that we talked about before the draft I know everybody had a fetish for a one tech, a big guy. And look, I was one of them. I was like, you got to get this big guy. But do you want to spend high second round assets, or in this case, multiple picks, a big trade, on a guy who's only going to be out there for first and second down and who's not going to be out there in the down that you call all the time, the money down? Do you really want to spend, if you want to get that guy, go get him in the fourth round like the Bills did, because that ain't the money downs. The money downs are the guy you want to go out and pick your first and second and third round players on and make your trade ups for. So I get that part of it. The more I've thought about Sanders, the more I've liked him. I do want to point out that Walker, for me, was a super fun guy. Look, the Bills brought up the idea that he had the back injury, the stress fracture in the back last year. And obviously that's a thing, but the idea that that's going to suddenly go away is going to be great. I mean, we get some injury pie in the sky stuff from the Bills all the time, understandably so. It was Kyer Elam with the ankle injury. It's been Ed Oliver. There were like 17 guys who had high ankles that one season, and they're all going to be great the next year once that stuff is fixed. Look, with Walker, the upside is big, and I think that's one of the things that I take away from all three guys. You can see an outcome for Sanders and Jackson and Walker that is really high level. That is totally changing the defensive line. I don't know if it's very likely or possible, but it is, I should say, it is possible. I don't know how likely it is. And that is something that excites me about those three guys.
Oh, well, add one more thing about Walker. I know he's a massive human being, and you think, oh my gosh, like he's like Vince Wilfork, put him out there in the one tech. He really didn't play that wasn't his primary role at Kentucky. They put him on the edge sometimes, 3 tech, 4-eye. I think they eventually want him to become that player with more honing of his technique and craft and getting stronger. But like if they had to play a game today, he wouldn't be a good one technique. He plays really high, and that's not good for a guy who's trying to stuff the run. But I like the swing because at that point in the draft, we're trying to get home runs and maybe stop trying to hit it down the fairway.
Yeah, you're at pick 109. I mean, you get a 6'7", 340-pound guy at pick 109. I don't care what he used to play. That's a reasonable thing for me. And you're right. The thing that stood out to me on tape was for a gigundous man who you'd think you just plant in front of the football and say, just occupy space. He actually moves and can be versatile more so than you would think. All right, let's wrap this up with 3 categories, our superlatives here of the draft. And we're going to label these a little different than I think people might hear in general when it comes to a draft recap. Number 1, Carl, give me the guy that you cheered for the most, the guy that you were like pumping fists, like, yeah, I like that guy. I can't wait to watch him in blue and red.
I'm not exaggerating. I actually did say, yeah, and pump my fist when they took him. But Dorian Strong in the 6th round out of Virginia Tech, super excited about his film. I watched him, I believe, maybe sometime in early March, and I was like, yo, that's a Billsy corner. He's 6'1", 185 pounds. Not the fastest guy. I know he tested really well in terms of agility scores, but that's not really his game either. But he has extremely good feel for the position. You hear me talk about all the time about patience and confidence out there at cornerback. Well, when he's doing press bell against Miami, the best team on his schedule this past year, there's no fear in his eyes. He has a nice controlled pedal, nice crossover stab and getting out. I see a guy that the Bills see, you know what? The ceiling may not be high. It may not be super duper high just based off of the physical profile. That's how it always is going to work at cornerback. But I think the floor is somewhere that the Bills can work with. If you told me 10 years from now that Dorian Strong started for 4 or 5 seasons in the NFL, I'd be like, I saw a path for that. I really do. And he has a really nasty just one hand stab that screams confidence to me. Like usually because you're locking your hips when you do that. Like you can't. Those at home, just throw your arm out there. Your right hip don't move. Like you're vulnerable right there to a certain extent. So for him to do that over and over again screams of confidence and on a borderline arrogance to a certain extent. I'm sure his coaches are like, hey buddy, you keep doing that, you get beat to the inside. You come sit next to me on the bench. I really like the pick though, and I'm not going to compare it to 2022 where like, hey, the 6th round pick was better than the 1st round. But I think that's a player that the Bills will have high hopes for, even if they got him in the 6th round.
That was the joke, that like you could see it with Strong. Not that I think Hairston's a better player than Kyer Elam. I think there's more confidence, more optimism for sure. But it wouldn't stun us if we walk into, the 2027 Bills and think, wow, there's Dorian Strong starting. Are the Bills going to trade Maxwell Hairston this year? It could happen because I agree with you. The length and the press ability makes that guy something you can work with right off the bat in the NFL. My guy that I was cheering for, and just like you, legitimate fist bump, in part because I did kind of call it on X before the pick was made, but I can't wait to see Landon Jackson just go at it. look, this is a guy where the limitations, I think, pop. He's not super fast. He's not super quick. He's not a ridiculous bender because he's 6'6". He's like Greg Rousseau. He's a giant. But this guy is strong. He already knows how to go through the outside shoulder of an offensive tackle. And the more I watch and the more I just like, man, this feels like I'm watching Trey Hendrickson. Just a guy that can be large and dominate and dictate when it comes to rushing the passer. There are questions about him as a run defender. He does set a strong edge. You're going to hear that a lot, but he also can get moved out quite a bit. But that pass rush upside to me, just and look, sometimes, and let me know if you see this too, Carl. Sometimes you just watch a guy, and no matter what, like the individual technique stuff, or what the production says, or what the 40 time says, you just look at a guy and say that is going to work. And to me, Landon Jackson screamed that is going to work.
I'm a big fan of him because I remember listening to a podcast earlier this offseason, and I'm sorry for not giving the proper credit to who said it. But the bet that you make on edge rusher, like there's a hierarchy to it. The best edge rushers are the guys that have elite traits and elite production. That's Myles Garrett, that is Von Miller. Those are those guys. They go top 3, right? The next bet that you make, though, is the elite athleticism with so-so production. You always bet on the elite traits at edge rusher because there's a floor, and I know it's kind of backwards. You say, well, no, like shouldn't the floor be the production? It's inverse for edge rushers because they can rely on those athletic tools in some way, shape, or form. Because of those long arms, he will always be a guy who can set the edge from that perspective. If he can't do nothing else in the NFL, he can stick out his arm and hold a tight end at bay. That is just based off the God-given gifts that he's given. It's up to him to use some of those other gifts, like his really good broad jump, like his really good vertical jump, to turn that into a really elite first step. And I think that's where the bet that I really like, I'm a big fan of his, is just like you. I'm a big fan of betting on edge rushers with traits because it sets the floor as opposed to maybe some of the other positions where the production probably matters more. Edge rushers, it's flipped. I need the athletic traits in order to be out there down in and down out.
Second category is what draft pick of the Bills opened your eyes, whether it be a surprise or something that revealed about the player, the team, Brandon Beane. Give me the guy who opened your eyes in this draft.
I'm going to say it's Deion Walker because it enforced the idea that they felt, nah, this won't happen again. Like, our defensive line has to get reinforced. It's not necessarily more about the individual prospect and what he brings to the table. It's more about the fact they threw another resource at the defensive line, 3 in the first 4 rounds. That shows to me that there was clearly a level of, I don't want to say panic, but a level of like, hey, we got to giddy up on this, and this is unacceptable, the level of play that we had out there on the field. So I don't want to make it seem like, oh my gosh, like Deion Walker's a bad prospect or anything, but it's like, whew, the Bills are telling you something. We talked about this Sunday. Lion season stops draft day. The truth serum, pop that bad boy in there, and you know how the Bills feel about their roster. The Bills clearly felt their defensive line was not good enough, and putting all those resources into it clearly shows that.
Yeah, and I think not only is it the 3 guys they drafted, but Joey Bosa, Michael Hoyt, Larry Ogunjobi. They added 6 defensive linemen this year, draft and free agency. Now, a couple of making a play to week 7, but still, those are guys who are on the roster. And if you want to throw in the extension they gave Greg Rousseau, they poured a ridiculous amount of resources into that D line. And like you said, this is when the truth is being told. This is the truth serum being injected into Brandon Beane in that front office to explain what they felt like they needed to do. And obviously, it feels like, hey, did they watch the Super Bowl? I think they did. Obviously they did. But the thing that opened my eyes for me is Jackson Hawes in the 5th round. Because when you go into a draft, you're thinking about, you need pass rush, you need, stop the run, you need wide receiver. You don't think about, damn, they need a tight end who can just freaking block. And that's what they get with Jackson Hawes, because we've talked about Dalton Kincaid ain't a good blocker. And to me, Dawson Knox had a bad blocking year. Quentin Morris has never been a great blocker. Now you're bringing a guy that, look, no matter what Hawes can do, he comes from Georgia Tech. They're, an old school kind of option team. All he does is block. No, he does catch passes, but primarily he blocks, and he looks good. I mean, he moves, he leads, he can pass block. When you have that dimension for a team that likes to run 6 offensive linemen all the time, it makes such a difference. As good as Alec Anderson was last year in that role as the extra lineman, when you have a guy out there who's at least a legitimate pass catcher, and Hawes isn't great, but like he can go out there and run a seam. he can leak out of a backfield and make the catch without looking like Alec Anderson making the catch. And to me, the value of having that option, and you can still run Alec Anderson or a 6-0 line run, but to have that tight end to say, we can put him out there and he can block just as good as this offensive lineman probably and still be a threat as a receiver, I think could open up a whole bunch of options this year.
I'm right with you on that one, how that one opened my eyes up to how they feel. They clearly feel, you know what, our best way of going forward is doubling down on the way we won last year. We're going to be physical. We're going to run the route. We're going to have play action pass. And it's also telling they had 2 tight ends on the roster, but really only one, in my opinion. This is a conversation we'll have another day for a whole nother episode. I don't view Dalton Kincaid as a tight end no more because they don't view him as one. They don't use him as one. But that's a debate we'll have for another day, conversation for another day. But I'm right with you. That pick right there said a whole lot about how the Bills want to go forward.
Okay, last category here is we talked about the guy that opened your eyes. What was the pick or the move that closed your eyes? Kind of like, I don't know about this one.
Listen, I'm DBU all the way through, CB, all that good jazz, right? But when they took Jordan Hancock, I was like, okay, hold on. Like, where is the pathway for him becoming a player for the Bills that can change this team going forward, I guess, because I see him as a Cam Lewis replacement, which I think those players can be kind of gotten off the street. No disrespect to Cam Lewis. He's a very valuable player. Swiss Army knife all over the place. But they didn't draft Cam Lewis. I think that you can get another player like that from that perspective. So I was like, man, I think that's where you could have took your dart at wide receiver. I think that's where you could have took another, because best case scenario for Jordan Hancock, no disrespect for him, I think he is Cam Lewis. Best case scenario for a receiver you take in the 5th round, well, how much time you got for how many receivers that have popped that late in the draft? So
that's secure for that matter.
Exactly. So yeah. That isn't a knock on Jordan Hancock. He may prove me wrong and end up becoming a good player, but I thought at some point, where is the clear-cut path for Jordan Hancock helping this roster? Now, hey, if he beats Cam Lewis out for a roster spot this year, I'm wrong on April 28th.
Joe Goodberry, who's on Twitter, he's he's like a Bengals, film guy, really, really good. Enjoy his work. He loved the Jordan Hancock pick because he saw him as a Taron Johnson replacement. And as much as I respect his opinion and can kind of see the path there, like, I don't think Taron Johnson's going anywhere for a while. I don't know if I want to spend a draft pick now on a guy that, like, Taron Johnson's going to play for the Bills until he, like, breaks down. Like, they're not going to be like, oh, he's decreased a little bit his ability, we're going to move on. No, they're going to run that dude in the ground because it's way worth it to run that dude in the ground because he's awesome at what he does. So to bring Jordan Hancock in, now you want to make him the backup and a special teamer, I get that. But I agree with you that I think the path is tough there. For me, I was originally going to go with TJ Sanders as my cover my eyes guy because I don't think the ceiling is as high as with some of the other defensive line prospects. But the more I've thought about it, again, going back to the idea that you can put him in the one tech on passing downs, moving around, I think he'd be more effective. The thing that I, and I have a hard time really finding anything that I don't like about this class. The thing that does concern me, though, the Bills spent all these resources this year to remake the defensive line. But this defensive line draft from the jump was billed as a ton of solid guys, but not many spectacular guys. So, like, B pluses everywhere, but I don't know how many A's there are. And if you're going to go all in on a particular draft to remake your defensive line on a team that has been filled with B pluses forever, I don't know how optimistic I am with this group doing anything but just recycling the same old path, the same old formula, just with younger players. Now, look, these are 3 draft picks that are in day 7 of being on the Bills. So they could still be anything. And as we talked about, there is certainly an idea. You can visualize the high end outcome for these 3 guys. But in general, this draft was not one that was going to have a lot of these players. And you didn't even pick one of them in the top 40 picks. These are pick 42, pick 72, pick 109. So the concern for me is, yeah, they did all this on the D line, but we're going to get to January. Unless Joey Bosa is somehow elite, healthy Joey Bosa again, it's going to be the same old story with players who are good enough to beat the Jets and the Colts and the Bucks, but not the Chiefs and the Bengals and the Ravens.
That is the concern with this draft class, is if these guys just become good players, well, it goes in the win column, checking them all off, but they don't need good players. They need great players. So I don't know. Like you just said, we don't know. April 28th, we have no idea the trajectory of these players' careers, but you can guess certain things based off physical profile. But boy, if we come, like you said, it's January 15th, divisional round, and the number one topic of a concern is, boy, the Bills suck on third down. They haven't been able to get the quarterbacks all year. Do we think it's going to look any different against Joe Burrow and their backup offensive lineman like what happened in 2023? Well, then it's like, well, we just wasted all these resources again. How is this story ever going to change?
And I know we're kind of closing this on a negative note. I still think
I thought the draft, I thought the
good
draft was better.
Yeah,
I think go, B plus.
Yeah,
like,
it's exactly right. B plus. Not probably not an A, but absolutely a B plus. Hit needs, good players, upside, use the draft well. I think it was generally a good draft overall. But obviously there are concerns, and when you're the Bills, you pick 30 something every year, you're not going to be able to get that elite, ridiculous A plus class like New England just got.
Right. Like I said, if y'all want that, well, I'm not wishing it, but like have some of your better players get hurt and you end up like the Eagles getting Jalen Carter. Do y'all really want that, Bills Mafia? Do y'all truly want a chance to get Jalen Carter? You got to be bad to get Jalen Carter. I don't know. Like, whatever.
As always, you can check out Let's Talk Ball at RochesterFirst.com. You can click on the sports tab, find us at 8 Sports Extra. We're also on WIVB.com. We're also on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. I don't know when we'll be back. Probably do a OTA discussion. I don't know how much we're going to do Let's Talk Ball about guys running around in shorts. But you know what? I think we can come back and we'll have some things to say as the Bills get ready to head into the 2025 season. For Carl Jones, I'm Thad Brown. Thanks as always for watching Let's Talk Ball.